Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So, as many of you probably were made aware of, President Trump gave a speech last week where he talked about how, China and Venezuela and Iran were interfering in the US elections and compromising election systems, and that's why he actually won in 2020, and that's why they need to pass the Save America Act and crack down on election security so that the midterms aren't rigged. Now, on the face of it, I, like most sane people, assumed this was complete and total bullshit. But then I realized that he actually released batches of files trying to prove that this was going on. And I was really bored at work during this week, so on a whim, I decided to open up these files. I downloaded all of them, I started reading through them, and what I found was shocking and hilarious, and I knew I just had to make a video on it. So this is going to be a little different from my normal videos. I'm actually going to read through all of the files he released, or at least I'm going to read through all of the files in the first two batches that have to do with foreign interference. If this video does well, maybe I'll make a sequel where we talk about all the evidence for domestic voter interference. But for today, we're focusing only on the foreign threat, mostly China. There are three questions we want to answer today, okay? Question number one, did China or some other state actor interfere in the US elections? Question two, if that interference did happen, was it enough to significantly change the outcome of any election? Question three, was there an attempt by, the deep state or the intelligence community, whatever you want to call it, to hide this information from President Trump? Okay, those are the three questions we're going to answer today. At the end of each section, this video will be divided into half. So the first half will focus on the first file dump, which is about just sort of general election security, and the second half will focus exclusively on China. If you want to follow along with me, here's what you need to do. Go to this website here, whitehouse.gov/election integrity. It'll bring you to this page. Here you can watch the full Trump speech. I'm not going to do that because it was really boring. But here is where I'm getting all these files from. So this right here is the first set of files we'll be looking at, and this right here is the second set of files. Like I said, there's also two additional batches, but maybe I'll go over those at a later date. All right, with all that out of the way, let us begin. So I'll be going in order of the order they appear in the unzipped file, unless I specifically say otherwise. So this first intelligence report is about Venezuelan voting machines. Okay, let's begin. By the way, I'm going to read some of this verbatim, but I'm also going to try and summarize as much as possible where I can. And if there's information that I don't know, I don't have enough technical expertise to evaluate it, I will mention that, and I'll let you in the comments tell me what I missed, where I went wrong, etc. So first, let's read the summary of this. So the title of this report is Summary of Select Intelligence Reporting from 2004 to 2020 on Venezuela's Electronic Voting Manipulation Capabilities. Summary. Redacted. Intelligence Community Reporting from 2024 to 2020 documented persistent concerns about Venezuelan government manipulation of electronic voting systems and the potential national security implications for U.S. election infrastructure. The intelligence established that Venezuelan government officials developed sustained interest and likely some capability in manipulating electronic voting systems, including Smartmatic technology, to influence electoral outcomes in Venezuela. Okay, let's stop right there. That's the key. So, Trump's made a big deal about how Venezuela is rigging the votes, etc., etc. He's even hypothetically pressuring Maduro to admit as such in exchange for a lighter prison sentence or something like that. But this document we're reading right here only applies to elections in Venezuela. Keep that in mind as we continue. The 2006 Intelligence Committee assessment that Smartmatic's ties to Venezuela pose a national security threat was based on solid intelligence regarding Venezuelan government interests to influence U.S. politics and evidence of Venezuelan manipulation of their own electoral systems. We'll see evidence of that in a second here. This assessment led to U.S. government action forcing Smartmatic to divest its U.S. operations in 2007. So this company that is the main focus of this intelligence report, Smartmatic, used to be involved in U.S. elections, but has not been involved since 2007. Let's continue. Redacted reporting indicated that electronic voting systems contained vulnerabilities that could theoretically be exploited by sophisticated actors with insider access. However, while the intelligence validated significant concerns about foreign-linked voting technology vendors, it did not definitively confirm that large-scale electronic fraud was successfully executed in specific Venezuelan elections, with CIA's baseline assessments maintaining that other factors better explained electoral outcomes. The reporting on advanced techniques like redacted, provided concerning insight into alleged Venezuelan government capabilities and intent, but came from limited sourcing. So, let me summarize the summary. Basically, what they're saying is there is evidence that Venezuela rigged their own elections, but it did not necessarily translate to large-scale electronic fraud that could be used to sway the entire election. And there are other factors that might better explain why the election went the way it did. Let's continue. So, I'm not going to read all of this, but I'll read this paragraph here. Redacted intelligence sources between 2004 and 2020 reported that Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolas Maduro demonstrated sustained interest in manipulating electoral outcomes through electronic voting systems. In April 2004, intelligence reporting indicated Chavez stated his objective was to prevent the re-election of a sitting U.S. president, suggesting intent to influence U.S. domestic politics. Okay, we're gonna come into this issue a lot while we analyze these documents. Intent to do something does not mean they actually did it, okay? Just because you intend to do something does not mean you have the capabilities, and even if you do have the capabilities, does not mean you followed through on that, whatever it was. All right, this will become important later. The finding was part of the basis for the intelligence community's 2026 assessment that Smartmatic's acquisition of U.S. voting system company Sequoia posed a moderate threat to U.S. national security. Okay, again. So what happened was there was a U.S. subsidiary of this Venezuelan company Smartmatic named Sequoia, and basically the U.S. government forced them to completely separate, to divest from each other, so that Venezuela could not influence our elections. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. Redacted reported that these plans for developing altered machines to approximately 300 voting centers in traditionally pro-Chavez areas to ensure victory by approximately 1.5 million votes. Following the election, which Chavez won by approximately 1.6 million votes, sources reported that Chavez congratulated his team for successfully implementing the manipulation plan. So here it's saying that Victor Chavez directly tampered with the voting machines used in the election to ensure that he not only won the election, but won by a very, very big margin to sort of shore up his legitimacy with the people. I do not doubt that this is true. The Venezuelan democracy is heavily flawed, and I definitely wouldn't put it past Chavez or Maduro to use these schemes to make themselves appear more popular than they actually are. Redacted. In September 2020, Redacted reported that Venezuela, Redacted, had developed detailed technical plans to manipulate the December 2020 National Assembly elections using what were redacted. This was I believe this was the election where Juan Guaido received all of his attention and popularity and lost to Maduro, at least according to Maduro. According to this report, the technique involved creating a second set of virtual machines that would replicate legitimate voting machine results, then substitute manipulated data while making votes appear to originate from legitimate machines. So basically this is describing the process that was involved. People would vote, but it's kind of like a credit card reader, right? Or a card reader. So when you put your card into the machine, you think it's just a normal like payment system, but really there's like a reader attached to it that pretends to process the payment while actually scraping your data. This is kind of the same thing. It scrapes your data and then changes the result of your vote, all while making it appear legitimate. I'll cherry pick a couple of quotes from this next section. So here we go. The report assessed that if such manipulation occurred, quote, elections in Venezuela and other countries that are clients of the technology provider could be in doubt. However, CIA's baseline assessment maintained that no large-scale electronic fraud occurred in 2020 based on pre-election polling data, absence of irregular voting patterns, and the opposition's concession. So, even though it seems crazy to us, in 2012, Chavez was still enormously popular, and the CIA is basically saying that even though they had the capability to manipulate the election, it almost looks like they didn't need to because, when you give everybody free hospitals and free food, they tend to want to vote for you. All right, let's skip down a little farther. These outline all the different specific techniques that the Venezuelan government used to manipulate their votes. You can read through that if you want. I'm going to be skipping farther down. All right, here we have the limitations and analytical caveats. This is the last section. So first it says, first, the 2006 intelligence community assessment concluded that neither Smartmatic nor the Venezuelan government had the capability, that is, the level of control or access required, to manipulate the outcome of an election outside of Venezuela in a predictable fashion. So this is saying that as of 2006, there was no evidence that they could have influenced any other elections except for their own. The Venezuelan government's ability to manipulate the results of voting in Venezuela rested in part on its ability to control every stage of the election voting process, from initial acquisition of the machines to pre- and post-voting machine security to programming to proper stage of voting receipts to control of the audit process. Neither the Venezuelan government nor Smartmatic would have such a complete spectrum of access during an electoral process outside of Venezuela. So to summarize, even if, let's say, that these machines were compromised, they would immediately be discovered because any country outside of Venezuela would have a rigorous security process that they would go through. And at some point in all of these steps that they outlined here, the fraud would have been discovered. Okay? But elections inside Venezuela, since all elections are controlled by the central government, it is not true that the fraud would have been discovered inside Venezuela. Okay. Second, CIA's baseline assessment regarding Venezuela's 2012 election maintained that large-scale electronic fraud did not occur despite redacted reporting of manipulation plans. This assessment was supported by pre-election polling showing Chavez ahead by approximately 10 percentage points, a 24% increase in government spending before the election, the opposition's concession of defeat, and CIA quantitative analysis showing no irregular voting patterns indicative of systematic manipulation. So again, I already said this, but 2012, no evidence of voter fraud. Chavez led in the polls by 10 percentage points, and they boosted government spending ahead of the elections to give more people, food or healthcare or whatever. Third, the 2013 Devil's Advocacy report that outlined a plausible fraud scenario was explicitly an alternative analysis exercise rather than definitive fighting. I skipped over this earlier, but basically the CIA ran like a war game kind of, where they said, well, could there have been fraud? Like if there were wide scale voter fraud in Venezuela, what would it look like? And they gamed the scenario, but this was a scenario that they ran, not a definitive finding. Okay. Last up, fourth, the September 2020 reporting on, and then there's a big redaction, and judge the regime did not need to resort to gross fraud to win the December 2020 National Assembly elections, given that virtually the entire opposition boycotted the regime and had already co-opted opposition party leaders. Yes, so in 2020, basically the opposition said, we already know that this election is going to be rigged, and so basically every single opposition candidate refused to run, and all of their supporters boycotted the election. Now, of course, this led to Maduro's party winning in an overwhelming landslide, but the point was made, right? The point was made. They boycotted the election so they could claim it was illegitimate afterwards, all right? But basically, because everybody boycotted the election, there was no need really for the Venezuelan government to rig the election. And finally, this entire last page is redacted. Super helpful. All right, let's move on to the next file. All right, this next report concerns China's cyber activities probably prelude to election espionage. And this is from Wire. Wire is like a secure information sharing platform for all the various U.S. intelligence agencies. By the way, the government, they love their acronyms. Anytime an acronym pops up, I will say the name of the acronym, but I will only say it once so as to save time. So make sure you pay attention. All right, here we go. China is probing the presidential campaign for opportunities to tailor collection and gather insights on policy positions on U.S.-China issues. U.S. policy on China is a long-standing high collection priority for Beijing, and Chinese cybersecurity actors have conducted such activity in every U.S. presidential election campaign since at least 2008, according to redacted open-source reporting. So what this is saying is China values the U.S.'s attitude towards itself, right? That is a very important issue for China. They want to basically maintain friendly relations with the United States until they invade Taiwan, after which they don't care if the U.S. is hostile. But until that point is reached, they want to do everything they can to make sure the U.S. and China have good relations so that they can maintain their business ties, their trade relationship, and so on. Now, what this is saying is, in order to facilitate that, they need to basically understand every candidate's position on China, and in order to understand their positions, China has been spying on every U.S. candidate since at least, again, 2008. Let's continue. Since redacted 2008, Chinese cyber actors known in the private sector as APT31 redacted have targeted the personal email accounts of U.S. senior leadership, including in the executive office of the president and high-ranking officials in multiple executive branch organizations, Congress, and the federal judiciary, redacted. So this is basically saying that the list of people that China is targeting casts a pretty wide net. Since 2017, a separate redacted has worked with the redacted to enable more stealthy operations by identifying the email addresses of high-level U.S. officials, then requesting that redacted obtain or crack the passwords for targeted accounts redacted. So basically, there are specific U.S. officials that China is going after, and the way they're going after them is hacking into their email. All right, this is the important bit. As the 2020 election approaches, the IC, which stands for Intelligence Community, has detected Chinese state-sponsored cyber actors targeting the former vice president's presidential campaign, probably to gather intelligence that would enable future operations, the first instance this election cycle that we have seen them directly targeting a U.S. presidential campaign. So, former vice president here means Joe Biden. So, Trump has been claiming that China intervened in the 2020 election to get Joe Biden elected, when in fact China was directly spying on Joe Biden's campaign. Let's continue. China has also conducted cyber espionage against other U.S. election-related entities, redacted. We don't know what those entities are because it's redacted. The intelligence community assesses that China does not currently intend to covertly interfere to sway the outcome of the election, although this activity could enable such operations if Beijing made a decision to do so. So again, here we have in the plainest reading so far that China may have the capabilities but does not have the desire to interfere in the election, or at least the 2020 election. As the 20th of May, APT31 actors have sent spear phishing emails containing links to the Gmail accounts of staffers associated with the presidential campaign, redacted. On June 4th, Google announced that APT31 was targeting the campaign. Google and FBI both briefed campaign officials on the Chinese cyber operation shortly after discovering the activity. Google officials have publicly stated that the spear phishing attempts were unsuccessful. Redacted. So basically, Google is saying even though the Chinese tried to obtain the email addresses of all these campaign staffers, it didn't work. During the past year, Chinese cyber actors have collected U.S. election-related information from U.S. voter databases, a polling data company, political and nonprofit organizations, fundraisers, and advisory organizations for political campaigns, redacted. So this is saying that China has also tried to gather as much data as possible on U.S. voter information. APT31's method of sending tracking links suggests that the Chinese operators are mapping out the target network for follow-on approaches, possibly including tasking campaign staffers' email accounts in the Chinese military signals intelligence system for collection. Tracking links collect metadata, such as internet activity and system information, that the operators can use to exploit the accounts and identify other targets of interest. So this is classic like intelligence 101, right? What you want to do is you want to build a map of relationships between all these people, right? So you pick a person, you get as much information on them as possible, phone number, email, address, all that stuff, and then you use that information to link them to other accounts. And slowly over the course of your investigations, you build a complete profile of the web of everybody associated with, in this case, a presidential campaign. All right? Knowledge of the campaign's officials, operating systems, and softwares would allow cyber actors to determine whether they could quickly exploit known vulnerabilities or if they needed to develop malware to gain undetected access to the victim's machines. If a target operated a spear phishing email with a tracking link. Even without clicking on any links, it would confirm an active account for the cyber actors, potentially narrowing the target list for future blank operations. Okay. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So then we get a bunch of stuff that's redacted, and we get basically the source for all this data. Okay? This was a CIA document that has been released to the public. All right. That was pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to summarize anything. Let's move on to the next one. All right, next up we have an election report by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Wow, that's a mouthful, or CISA for short. This is going to outline basically the vulnerabilities that exist within American election systems from a cybersecurity perspective. Let's start. So, from around 2019 to 2024, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, conducted a set of technical and operational activities to evaluate the security of certain U.S. election systems. These activities, all carried out upon the request of system owners and operators, included direct examination of election-related software, penetration testing of state, local, tribal, and territorial networks, and incident response operations for intrusions into election systems. Through these activities, CISA developed a strong understanding of the vulnerabilities that, at the time of testing, affected select election-related software products and network environments evaluated by CISA. And every software product or election-related network in which CISA identified a vulnerability, CISA notified the owner or operator of the vulnerable product or network and encouraged them to mitigate the vulnerability. So what this is saying is, it's basically these guys' job to identify holes in our election cybersecurity infrastructure. And what they're saying is that they investigated these holes, and wherever they found these holes, they notified the people responsible for fixing them, and hopefully those people fixed them. Let's continue. CISA's findings highlight the reality that election-related software, like all complex software, contains vulnerabilities that require timely remediation. While past partnerships with election vendors enabled early identification of security weaknesses prior to product release, structural constraints in the certification ecosystem significantly limit vendors' abilities to patch systems quickly. For example, some government election system certification regimes require that no patches be applied for months before an election. These limitations, combined with inconsistent vulnerability disclosure practices, result in election systems being deployed with known and unpatched security issues. So basically, there exists a rule in our elections that no security patch, no update to the software can happen for a couple months before the election. Also, in some cases, there is little to no requirement for vulnerabilities in these systems to be disclosed to the government. So they're saying that both of these are a huge problem. Beyond software quality, CISA's assessments repeatedly show that the IT networks operated by SLTT election offices lack cybersecurity hygiene. When cybersecurity people say hygiene, they just mean like best practices. Okay. Many election vendor threat models assume strong network segmentation and isolation of election systems. This means each part of the network is isolated from each other so that if one part is breached, the entire network doesn't go down. However, in practice, election infrastructure is so often accessible from general enterprise networks, creating opportunities for lateral movement by adversaries who compromise email systems, user workstations, or other information technology assets. Weak identity management, limited logging, and insufficient segmentation exacerbate the risk that a cybersecurity threat actor could access or disrupt mission-critical election IT components. Okay. So what this is saying is, first of all, weak identity management means that someone's identity, like a user identity, is not tracked or regulated across the entire system. Limited logging means there's little record of what a user does once they are logged into the system. And insufficient segmentation is what I talked about earlier. It means the different parts of the system are insufficiently separated from each other so that one part of the system could be compromised and that could compromise everything else. Okay. Overall, the security of U.S. elections is shaped by the interaction of these three major factors. Number one, software vulnerability management constrained by outdated certification regimes. Number two, inconsistent transparency from election system vendors on vulnerabilities and patch status. And number 3, the cybersecurity immaturity of many SLTT networks responsible for hosting election systems. Addressing these challenges will require coordinated action across technical, policy, and regulatory domains. This report provides detailed analysis and proposes targeted recommendations to strengthen election infrastructure, security, enhance public trust, and the resilience of the nation's election infrastructure. By the way, this report is published this year on July 13th, 2026. Okay? So, I'm not going to read all of this, but I will read the introduction. Towards the middle here, it gets really into the weeds as far as like technical jargon goes, and I don't really understand it. Again, if you understand IT better than I do, please read through this and, leave a comment down below on basically what they're saying. Okay, I will, however, read this introduction. From around 2019 to 2024, CISA evaluated the security posture of election entities through multiple, mutually reinforcing technical activities. These included, upon the request of relevant entities, direct source coding and binary analysis of election software, protocol and interface assessments, penetration testing, and red team operations against SLTT networks, and response operations for cybersecurity incidents affecting those same partners. Together, these activities provided CISA with a multi-layered view of the vulnerabilities across the software supply chain, development environments, operational workflows, and adversary targeting trends. In every case, the CISA identified a vulnerability in software product or election-related network. CISA notified the owner or operator of the vulnerable product or network and encouraged them to mitigate the vulnerability. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead. So yeah, here they outline like what they did to gather all this information. Here they outline how not updating security software can cause problems. Here they outline how the security procedure for these networks are creating problems. Here they outline the failure to segment. I'll read this part because it's important. American citizens have the right to know when the infrastructure that runs elections has been compromised and what happened as part of that incident. I completely agree. By openly acknowledging incidents and describing mitigation steps, vendors and localities can show that they are proactively defending critical infrastructure rather than obscuring vulnerabilities. This transparency encourages continuous improvement, drives investment in stronger defenses, and reinforces that protecting elections is a collective national priority. Clear and consistent disclosure strengthens accountability across the institutions responsible for safeguarding election systems. Even the perception of secrecy around cybersecurity incidents can erode trust faster than the incidents themselves. This is something that we've seen recently, right? Basically, the failure of these government agencies and institutions to say when they've been hacked, to say what the vulnerabilities are, allows Trump to go in and just make shit up, right? He can just say anything, and because these agencies have been keeping what actually happened a secret, we have no story to believe but the one Trump is telling us. Communicating early, often, and honestly, while still protecting sensitive operational details, helps ensure that Americans maintain faith in the integrity of their elections and the resilience of the systems that support them. I couldn't agree more. All right, here we get the steps that this agency recommends that we take. So, number 1, harmonize relevant patch management and certification rules for voting systems and associated IT infrastructure to follow cybersecurity changes to be made real time without impacting certification. Okay, so basically, there needs to be consistent rules across the board. Adhere to the CISA's best practices for securing election systems, and they link their website. Use human-readable paper ballots. I mean, this will work for small-scale counties, but something tells me it will not work for, counties with hundreds of thousands of people in them. Conduct post-election manual audits of paper ballots to confirm that voting machine systems function as intended and to identify errors prior to the certification of the results. Sure. Encourage election software providers to A, assign common vulnerabilities and exposure CVE numbers for vulnerabilities in their software. So basically label all found vulnerabilities with a number so that they can be referenced. Provide notice to customers if election software code is leaked or stolen. Report cybersecurity incidents to the relevant authorities. And D, include a software bill of materials with all products. Finally, number 6, ensure clear, consistent, and transparent documentation of all security incidents and remediation processes. I agree. All right, in conclusion, CISA's findings highlight that U.S. election systems are subject to the same security concerns as most other software systems. They are subject to outdated and fragmented certification regimes, insufficient vulnerability transparency, and persistent cybersecurity gaps in SLTT operating environments. These issues are not attributable to any single entity, but are the result of a complex interdependence between vendors, certifiers, policymakers, and resource-constrained SLTT partners. So let's pause there. So basically what they're saying is that there's no one individual person to blame. Basically, nobody went out there and said, hey, I want to make our elections, easily compromised. I want people to be able to cheat in them. This is the result of multiple overlapping failures from basically every step of this voter election process, from the vendors, that means people selling the software, the certifiers, people certifying the election, the policymakers, that means the legislator, people in Washington, and the intelligence community itself, the constrained SLTT partners. Finally, strengthening election system security requires coordinated action across the entire ecosystem. SLTT election offices need sustained investment in network modernization, segmentation, identity management, and monitoring capabilities. CISA's recommended mitigation measures, including paper-based voting records, rigorous post-election manual audits, SBOM adoption, and improved incident tracking, provide a path towards measurable near-term improvements. Now, all this I agree with, except for maybe the paper-based voting records thing. All this is fine with me. The thing is, though, Trump is not doing this, right? His Save America Act has some bullshit about voter IDs, and you have to present your birth certificate or a passport. It has absolutely nothing to do with actually making sure that, from a cybersecurity standpoint, our elections are safe. Okay? He does not actually care if people can hack into the elections. All he cares about is basically disenfranchising as much people as possible so that he can steal the midterms, in my opinion. So while, yes, there are vulnerabilities in our election system, Trump is not taking any effort to meaningfully address them. I hope the next president reads this document and takes some of the steps that are recommended. Let's move on to the next one. All right, here we have an email chain, and the subject of this email chain is entitled Everyone's Favorite Topic, which is a little weird in my opinion. This email comes from December 23rd, 2020. Let's read. So, take a minute and read through this report. It cites some of the same intel and logic used in 2020 to say that these same units were not engaged in election influence, but were instead only issue focused to argue that China is influencing the the redacted election. The regional influence focus on issues, etc. They literally cite as support for their argument some of the same reporting used in the mainline assessment in our minority report. We'll see what this minority report and this mainline assessment are here in a second. For example, they cite redacted activity as being the Chinese military, even though in 2020 the IC said we didn't know who it was. The report describes the same unit that, redacted, and I said were influencing the 2020 election and now characterizes it as an election influence unit and attributes it to the Chinese government. That's a weird coincidence and one we should highlight for oversight, FBI, and redacted. We should consider how this looks and on what logical nonpartisan basis the IC makes calls one way or the other. Why is this unit engaged in election influence in the redacted and redacted to promote Chinese interests, but when they do it here it's issue influence, but somehow not election related? It's the same personnel doing the same kind of activity. So to summarize, there's inconsistency in the reporting here. So in one report it says that this group of Chinese agents, and we don't know what group this is because it's redacted, it said that in one report they were only trying to influence U.S. policy, right? They were only trying to, hypothetically, improve Chinese-U.S. relations, but later the same group of people is accused in a different report of actively trying to influence the election. Okay, there's a discrepancy here, and the person that wrote this email found that discrepancy very troubling. So, this is weird by itself, but is not evidence of anything malicious. Maybe it was a mistake. We don't really know, okay? But if this was real and was not a mistake and was directly ordered, maybe, potentially, this could be counted as evidence of covering up Chinese influence the election. Let's keep reading to find out more. All right, next up is an email, but this email is in response to a report, so I'm going to skip it for now and come back to it when we read that report. and here is that report. Okay, this is the real meat and potatoes of this whole file dump. This is a National Intelligence Council assessment, and it is dated the 19th of August, 2020. So this is before the 2020 election, which happened in November of the same year. All right, I'm going to read a lot of this, but again, I'll skip around like usual. Ahead of the 2020 U.S. election, foreign states will continue to use covert and overt influence measures in their attempt to sway U.S. voters' preferences and perspectives, shift U.S. policies, increase discord in the United States, and undermine the American people's confidence in our democratic process. Foreign states or other actors may seek to compromise our election infrastructure for a range of possible purposes, such as interfering with the voting process, stealing sensitive data, or calling into question the validity of the election results. We judge that Russia, China, Iran, as well as many non-state actors have the capability to conduct such activities, although it would be difficult for them to manipulate voting processes at a scale without detection. We are primarily concerned about the ongoing and potential influence activity by Russia, China, and Iran. Redacted, we assess that Russia is using a range of measures primarily to denigrate former Vice President Biden and what it sees as anti-Russian establishment. For example, it is directing or encouraging proxies to spread claims about Vice President Biden. Some Kremlin-linked actors are also seeking to boost President Trump's candidacy on social media. More broadly, Moscow efforts seek to amplify social discord in the U.S. and undermine Washington's global standing. All right, let's stop right there. So, we have here plainly laid out for us that Russia would prefer Trump to win. And this makes sense, right? Putin understands how to manipulate Trump, okay? Putin understands that if he flatters Trump, if he, gives him little crumbs of attention or affection, it'll boost Trump's ego, and basically he can turn Trump into Putin's dog. Now, that hasn't exactly worked out in modern times, but, for example, Trump did stop sending all support to Ukraine, and in Putin's head, that is a win. So, Putin thought that Trump would be much more easier to control than Biden, or Kamala in this case, and that's why Putin wants Trump to win. This also ties back to the Russian interference scheme in 2016. People call it the Russia hoax. It's not a hoax. 7 people were arrested and sent to jail. A bunch more were indicted. It was very obvious that Russia was trying to boost Trump. It's just that there was no ever direct link between Trump and Putin. In other words, there's no evidence that Trump encouraged Putin to take the steps that he did. Okay? I should also highlight that one of the goals for all these potential foreign actors is to destabilize the United States, right? That is almost the primary objective, okay? It is much more important for Russia, China, and Iran that the U.S. essentially go to war with itself than either candidate really win. So in all of these actors, in all these countries' minds, the closer the election, the more contentious the results, the better. Keep that in mind as we continue. We assess that China prefers that President Trump be defeated. In the past few months, it has stepped up public rhetoric criticizing his administration, which it recognizes may affect the election. Although redacted, Beijing did not intend to try to affect the elections. Redacted, online influence and collecting derogatory information about U.S. public officials, redacted. Okay, so what this is saying is, again, there's no evidence that Beijing tried to influence the election, but according to the intelligence community, China didn't want Trump to win in 2020. And again, this makes sense because Trump is erratic and, imposed these tariffs on China. And even though they didn't have that big of effect on China at the time, China would prefer the devil you know to the devil you don't, okay? There's really no predicting Trump's actions, especially when it comes to things like tariffs, as we've seen in his current term. So China preferred the stability to Biden over the chaos that could potentially come with another Trump regime. Lastly, we are monitoring for signs that other countries or non-state actors, such as criminal groups, are acting on their preferences for the election and attempting to covertly influence public opinion, disrupt election operations, or jeopardize election data with tactics such as the use of ransomware. It's worth noting that in both China and Russia's case here, the main way it appeared that they're influencing elections is through social media, right? They are essentially spreading propaganda across social media platforms using, among other things, bot accounts or directly paying influencers, as was the case with Tenet Media, cough, cough, to try and influence the election. Okay? So this is not them directly, hacking into voting machines or anything. It's more like swaying public opinion through the use of social media and propaganda. So, so this section's on Russia, and the whole first part of this is conspicuously redacted, very conspicuously redacted. I wonder why. Okay. The second paragraph, here we go. Redacted, President Putin and senior Russian officials are overseeing efforts by proxies, redacted, to spread claims about former Vice President Biden, as well as Ukrainian politicians, and alleged Ukrainian influence in the 2016 U.S. election. So remember, this is the whole Burisma scandal, the whole Hunter Biden laptop, Trump fired the prosecutor in Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of history to this. Look it up on your own time. It's basically ancient history at this point, but at the time in 2020, it was all hot, it was all fresh, it was all controversial. These claims include that when the former vice president was in office, he engaged in criminal activity in his dealings with Ukraine and individuals tied to Ukraine. Energy firm Burisma, Kimlik, and other proxy actors affiliated with the Russian government are advancing such narratives with U.S. officials and other prominent persons, as well as online, including through personal interactions and audio and documentary films released via U.S. and Ukrainian media outlets. Okay. Redacted, these figures are conspiring to intensify their efforts as the election approaches to orchestrate a high-profile corruption scandal implicating former Vice President Biden and the Democratic Party at the peak of the 2020 U.S. presidential campaign. Their aim is to defeat the former Vice President and ensure the president's victory. Some of these proxy actors anticipate that Ukraine-themed narratives around Democratic corruption will play a decisive role in the election, and that U.S. persons are key to propagating those narratives. So, again, Trump released these documents. This is all Trump's intelligence services releasing these documents. What they are saying is the whole Ukraine thing in the 2020 election is basically a hoax. It was a Russian-funded, Russian-pushed influence campaign designed to discredit Joe Biden. They are explicitly stating that here in plain language, okay? Which is pretty funny. Let's cherry pick some other examples because I don't want to read all of this. Russian actors have circulated narratives about voter fraud resulting from mail-in balloting and called some U.S. primary voting processes rigged by the Democratic Party. Again, this all ties back into Trump's rhetoric, and basically Russian actors pushed his rhetoric forward. Not necessarily because they prefer Trump, although they definitely do, more so to sow discord, sow distrust, and to divide America. All right, that's their ultimate goal. Russia has for years targeted and collected information about current and former U.S. officials, which could leak to the public at any time. All right, this was the whole, Trump calling on Putin to release the Hillary Clinton's emails, etc. All right, finally we get to the most important one. We get to China. We assess that China prefers that the president, whom Beijing sees as unpredictable and tough on China, does not win re-election, like I said. Although redacted, Beijing did not intend to affect the election, redacted, online, redacted influence, and collecting derogatory information about U.S. public officials, big redaction, okay. China uses mostly enticements and occasional coercion to extract more pro-China positions and to punish those whom Beijing views as opposed to China's interests. It also employs disinformation and critical statements attacking the U.S. government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and other issues such as the closure of the Houston consulate, Hong Kong, the legal status of the South China Sea, and China's efforts to dominate the 5G market. Okay, let's break this down. So, if you remember, during the early days of COVID, there was almost a propaganda war between Trump and between China over whose fault it really was. Trump was saying it was China's fault, China knew about the virus, they lied, and then they made a killing off of basically selling PPE equipment to the rest of the world, whereas China was, spreading wild stories about how it was like a U.S.-funded lab or something that leaked the virus in the first place. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with what they were saying. Hong Kong, that's obvious. China wants Hong Kong to be integrated with them. The U.S. kind of wants them to remain autonomous. And finally, the legal status of the South China Sea. There is an ongoing dispute between a bunch of different countries, between China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei over land, or in this case, ocean in the South China Sea. China claims all of it. The other countries have various overlapping claims. It's a whole big thing. It's a mess. You can look into that on your own time. Okay. Redacted, a pro-China network of online accounts, posted video content critical of President Trump before it was deactivated by social media platforms. Redacted. We assess Beijing probably calculates that a concerted effort to redact influence the presidential election would, redacted, backfiring and other uncertain benefits, but redacted also recognizes redacted, critical statements might affect the race. So basically, what this last part is saying is, if China were to influence the election, they reckon that it would be discovered, and the fact that it's discovered would undermine their efforts to actually influence the election, which is probably why they're sticking to this sort of social media influence, and they're not actually trying to directly influence the election. Here we have a bunch of shit that's redacted. Finally, Redacted, a newspaper owned by the Chinese, Redacted claimed that economic measures Beijing could take against supporters of legislation and lawsuits seeking compensation for the China over the COVID-19 pandemic may impact U.S. state and congressional races. This is the first time we have observed Beijing issuing a public warning that suggests it is willing to impose economic costs that could affect U.S. elections. Redacted, we judge that China will, redacted, evaluate the implications of various electoral outcomes on its interests. If Beijing were to access the increasingly downward trajectory in U.S.-China relations, that's a bit of an understatement, threaten China's rise and could not be dealt with using existing tools, it might attempt to more directly thwart the president's re-election, including by leaking information redacted, or through online redacted influence network. $10 says this redaction right here says the Epstein files. Okay. So what this is saying is, if China feels that it's backed into a corner, it might take things a step farther and start either leaking information or directly interfering in U.S. elections. But as of 2020, China did not feel it necessary to do that. We have a bunch more redactions, and finally we get to the next part, which is Iran. Iran is conducting an influence campaign to undermine the current president and U.S. democratic institutions and to divide the country in advance of the 2020 election, like I've been saying. Tehran sees the current administration as promoting regime change in Iran. Wow, that was prescient. Redacted, a view that increases the Iranian leadership's interest in trying to prevent the president's re-election. Iran's efforts probably will focus on online covert influence, such as spreading disinformation on social media and circulating anti-U.S. content. Big redaction. Redacted, Supreme Leader Khomeini probably has authorized the influence campaign. These efforts largely focus on creating or amplifying social media content that criticizes the president and recirculating existing news reports, memes, and hashtags focused on U.S. civil unrest, domestic protests for racial justice, mail-in voting, and the administration's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to stop here and mention there's actually evidence that during the George Floyd protests, Chinese, Russian, and Iranian agents were boosting essentially videos of both rioting and looting and police brutality in an effort to make the protests, make the riots go a step further and make the government crackdowns on those riots more intense. All right, this was a mostly clear-cut case of them trying to sow division within the United States, and this paragraph here says as much. Over the past 2 years, social media companies have removed thousands of Iranian origin inauthentic accounts, some with links to the Iranian government, that have shared information critical of both the current president and other presidential campaigns, and that even impersonated a candidate in 2018. Tehran also uses the accounts to attempt to influence U.S. audiences by promoting messages aligned with Iranian policies. Redacted, Tehran's links to some of these efforts. I wonder how, Elon Musk's ownership of Twitter is now dealing with all of these Iranian proxies and such. I'd be curious to find out. Iran could attempt to manipulate or attack election interference, as it has in elections in the Middle East and South Asia, but we do not have any information indicating that it intends to do so in the United States. So basically what they're saying is there's no evidence Iran actually interfered in the election. It could also seek to collect and publicly release damaging information. In January, Iranian contract cyber actors tried to compromise a server associated with U.S. business involved in election infrastructure. Redacted, FBI worked with the company to remediate the problem. In June, Google announced that Iran-linked cyber actors had unsuccessfully attempted to spearfish email accounts associated with campaign staffers working for the U.S. president. Iran pursued such efforts in an attempt to acquire derogatory information it could release publicly, as well as to inform its broader aims of weakening the U.S. and damaging its standing abroad. All right. Finally, we get other foreign actors. So, a range of other foreign actors have expressed preferences for the outcome of the election. We have reporting on a few that have either considered or taken steps to attempt to covertly influence U.S. voters, presidential candidates, or U.S. politics around the election. For example, senior Turkish officials, including President Erdogan, believe that segments of the U.S. government have an entrenched anti-Turkey viewpoint, and as a result, sought to covertly influence U.S. politicians and politicians' candidates' thinking on Turkey. Ankara's efforts have, over the past year, included covert funds of the U.S. municipal elections, unregistered lobbying efforts, and messaging on social media by state-owned outlets. There was a huge scandal with, I believe it was former New York Mayor Eric Adams, where he took, I can't remember the exact number, but it was at least tens of millions of dollars from a Turkish lobbying group, and that was a very clear case of Turkish influence. So yes, this Turkish influence is happening. Okay. German Chancellor Merkel almost certainly would prefer that President Trump not win the re-election because of personal conflicts between the two leaders and our perception that the current administration policies have complicated Germany's, the EU's, and NATO's geopolitical positions. Yeah, Trump was not a big fan of Merkel, that's no secret, and Merkel was not a big fan of Trump in return. In public remarks in July, she implicitly criticized the president's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in June she cited the 2020 election as a risk factor for the EU during a private video call with the other European leaders. In mid-2019, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman expressed concerns that Riyadh would lose U.S. support for its priorities if the president were to lose the election in 2020. So all of the, Jared Kushner, all of the various deals, the fact that Trump just gave the go-ahead for Saudi Arabia to develop its own nuclear weapons, all that indicates that Trump and his family are heavily enmeshed with the Saudi royal family. There is a lot of corruption going on there. It is very obvious that Saudi Arabia would want Trump to win. It even says in this, at the end of this paragraph, the president was the most Saudi-friendly president of any U.S. president. Go figure. All right, and here we have a helpful little graphic that basically summarizes all the material that we have been going over so far. So, an X means not observed. A circle with a white dot means preliminary or preparation steps without specific intent, with or without specific intent, and a check mark means observed. All three countries have released press statements and state-run media content overtly trying to influence the public opinion. All three have covertly used messaging on social media. All three have tried covertly influencing executive branch or congressional leaders' thinking or policies. Russia and China have covertly influenced state or local governments' leaders' thinking or policies. Russia and Iran have publicized information gathered through intelligence operations to damage a U.S. political figure or organization. Russia has targeted accessing or manipulated election process or voting-related systems. Russia has influenced U.S. law enforcement investigations or aspects of the legal process. China has offering economic inducements to secure policy concessions. And China and Russia have retaliated for U.S. decisions or actions. And thus concludes the end of this report. All right, that was a mouthful. Let's move on. Or let's backtrack and go back to that email first. All right, so let's jump back to the email that we skipped previously. So we don't know who this email is to, but here we go. Hi, forwarding these comments from FBI for your awareness. They had previously told me that Director Bry signed off on the ICA threats, and the only changes since then have been downgrades of redacted reporting and the DNI's minor initial edits. Most of this we've been over numerous times already, so it's not clear to me if they're backtracking or just commenting for the record. And then we get a response. Hi, couple of thoughts on the updated ICA draft. By the way, they're referencing this document here that we just saw. Okay. Couple of thoughts on the updated ICA draft, all of which center on the minority view and some of which you have previously heard from the FBI team. Generally speaking, while we are fine with the inclusion of the minority view text box, we firmly believe that the analysis in said text box must comport to the same analytical standards as the rest of the ICA. This is an absolute red line for the FBI. Additionally, we do not support the inclusion of the minority view in the KJs without proper context and source description. The minority view is given parity to the ICA assessments. Below are some more specific points. So these reference the minority view, which is this document right here, which we will read next. But for now, let's talk about the problems that they had with it. So, according to this person, in the first paragraph, the NIO notes that Chinese leaders also intended some of Beijing's efforts to indirectly attack U.S. candidates, etc. The IC, that's the intelligence community, has repeatedly stated, based on a body of intelligence, there is no evidence of said intention, though we note there was an awareness of this potential effect. To state this bluntly, as the NIO does, without evidence to support this claim is extremely misleading. So basically they're saying you can't say that there is definite intent behind Beijing's actions when we found no evidence that such intent exists. In the second paragraph, the NIO notes he gives more weight to several clandestine and liaison reports without any sort of description whatsoever. By minimizing the source descriptions, clandestine reporting from U.S. or liaison sources of dubious credibility, poorly identified sourcing chains, and minimal track record of reporting is given the same weight as signals intelligence of identified senior Chinese diplomatic and intelligence figures, as well as clandestine reporting of decision-making in Beijing from sources with established records of reporting that is generally reliable. So, what this paragraph is saying is that the sources the minority report is using are bullshit. They're not going through the proper credibility procedures to determine the credibility of the sources. They are basically just reporting them factually and citing them to back up their argument. Okay. In the last tick, the NIO assesses China may have also encouraged protests. There is no evidence of this in the reporting, and the citations associated with this tick certainly do not support this assessment. This is highly misleading and a misrepresentation of the underlying reports. So this ties back to the whole George Floyd thing. I guess China was not involved in spreading those inflamed tensions all over social media. I think it was mostly Russia. Okay. The final paragraph in the dissent argues that we have collection gaps in the entities that would probably execute influence operations. This point appears to acknowledge that the IC collection demonstrated that Chinese leaders practiced restraint and did not intend to influence the outcome of the election, and instead focuses on where collection gaps might miss evidence of the execution of influence ops. This shift in focus by the NIO is inconsistent with earlier portions of the dissent argumentation, and argues that U.S. collection did not find what China has actually done. As we said before, citing the absence of evidence is an absolute red line for us. So basically what they're saying is, this minority report says that there hasn't been sufficient work done. There are gaps in our knowledge when it comes to Chinese influence of elections, and therefore China could have done anything. But that's a very poor argument, is what this email is saying. You can't just cite a hole in the collection of information and fill that hole with whatever you want. The absence of evidence is not evidence of anything. Okay? And then finally, thanks again for all the work on this blank. We will continue to stand by for any additional drafts, etc. On a more positive note, the Iran section edits are much improved, and we greatly appreciate you working. And by the way, this email is from the Counterintelligence Division. All right, so let's next look at the actual minority report that this email so heavily cites. All right, so let's look at the so-called minority report. No, not like the movie. Mainline judgments. The international community, including the NIO for East Asia and other NIC officers, assess Beijing has not deployed influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. Redacted. That Chinese leaders desire stability in the U.S.-China relationship, like I said earlier, and believe that they have a range of tools that can achieve their goals regardless of who wins the election. The IC also assesses, redacted, that the election of either candidate will present opportunities and challenges for China, probably informs their risk calculus against influencing the elections. The IC assesses that Beijing prefers to respond to U.S. actions with restraint to show resolve and preserve the ability to repair relations after the election. That makes sense, right? If they snoop around in our elections and get caught, the U.S.-China relationship is permanently damaged, while if they wait and hold their cards, there's always a chance that they can resolve things diplomatically later. Basically, this whole thing is a recap of what we just read in the previous report, but here is where things get interesting. All right, so an alternative perspective, indicators of influence efforts. Here's where the so-called minority opinion starts. The National Intelligence Organization, NIO, and DETA agree with the large majority of the IC's judgments about China's calculus and approach to the election. They assess, however, that the IC's judgment that no element of the Chinese government has taken any steps to influence the presidential election, redacted, at least through the summer. They also have less confidence in the rest of the IC that China's preparations for redacted influence efforts were not carried out, redacted, given contradictory reporting, redacted. That does not tell us much. The NIO and D/ETA assess redacted, over the summer redacted, private sector and open source reporting on the influence activities that already underway suggest that the Chinese government has been engaging in at least some level of influence, targeting U.S. voters and candidates with the knowledge that their activities could at least have an effect on the election outcome. Beijing began taking unspecified steps. Don't you love it when someone starts taking unspecified steps? That's my favorite. I'm about to take an unspecified step and put my foot up your ass. Redacted 2020 to damage the U.S. president's re-election campaign in response to U.S. pressure on China's redacted, technology sector redacted, planning discussions among redacted officials to respond to U.S. pressure while taking place at increased frequency, and that senior leaders expect China's semiconductor industry would continue to be damaged if the U.S. president were re-elected. Unspecified Chinese government officials redacted, Chinese redacted. Expect relief from sanctions if, as a result of their efforts, U.S. resolve weakened or a candidate from a named U.S. political party were elected instead of the president being reelected. Again, this is saying that they think that Biden will undo the tariffs, basically. All right, this next part's so redacted it's not even worth reading. Here we go. This part here is like circled in highlighter, so I'm going to read it. The NIO and DETA assess that China's redacted intend to at least indirectly affect U.S. candidates, voters' preferences, and political processes, thus meeting the definition of election interference. Redacted, the Chinese government has tasked its mission in the U.S. to use Chinese groups and organizations to incite protests in the U.S. to damage the president's public standing and undermine his re-election chances. Again, this is the part that was referenced in this email that we read that has basically no evidence to support it. During the same period, a pro-China influence network on U.S. social media platforms posted messages supporting Beijing's views that included some English language content, denigrating the president and his administration's policies. The activities of these networks are consistent with what we would expect to see from intelligence services or similar actors taking steps to build nascent online influence capabilities. The NIO and DETA assessment that their level of sophistication redacted. Although we cannot directly tie this network to the Chinese government, the NIO and DETA assess that elements of the government were, at a minimum, aware of and condoned the campaign and may have directed or conducted it. So basically they're saying that with all of these influence activities that take place on social media, they can't directly link it to the U.S. government, which means basically they lack the evidence to support their claim that China interfered in the U.S. elections. Awesome. We base this assessment on the alignment of the content with Beijing's overt messaging themes, its striking similarities to themes and tactics of previous redacted Chinese influence campaigns that seek to blend their influence operations into broader public discourse, the duration frequency of the activity spanning several months, the rapidity with which the network created videos in response to world events, and the network's consistent ability to operate outside the Chinese Great Firewall. The last part is true. It is pretty suspicious that they could do this and not have not have a direct thumbs up from the Chinese government. But again, they could just be a Chinese government affiliated organization. That does not necessarily mean they are receiving direct orders from, Xi Jinping or something. Okay, I'm kind of bored with this. Let's freaking skip to the conclusion. Here we go. On the left here is the mainline international community judgment, and this over here is just the minority judgment. So, both agree that broad influence efforts in the United States are being conducted by China. Both agree that there's probable preference for Trump's defeat. Both agree that China is considered an influence effort aimed at the president's election. Both agree that prepared options for influence efforts in presidential elections have been, undertaken. Both agree that there is risk versus gain in any influence effort, particularly if blowback is discovered. Both agree that China is prepared for victory by either Trump or Biden. Both agree that China avoided a whole of government influence effort and any interference with U.S. election systems. However, the minority assessment alleges that China intends public and diplomatic actions to undercut Trump in the election, and the minority opinion is that China has undertaken a few covert influence efforts to undermine Trump's re-election. So basically, in summary, this minority report alleges that China is actively undertaking covert steps to undermine Trump's re-election chances, whereas the majority opinion, the intelligence community, disagrees with that narrative. Now, I skipped over a lot of this because it basically just outlines all the various ways that China, allegedly, according to the minority report, was seeking to influence the election. But based on this, combined with this mainstream intelligence community report, combined with this email right here, I think we can pretty much safely ignore any conclusions that the minority report comes to. All right, we got one more file left. Don't fail me now. All right, this last document here is entitled Vulnerabilities in U.S. 2020 Election Infrastructure, and is kind of a summary of all of the previous reports that we've looked at. It is dated the 15th of January 2020. And also, while I was recording this, I realized that it's going to be a lot longer than I initially intended. So I will be releasing this video in two parts. This is the first part. In the second part, we will actually look at the China-specific evidence that Trump has released. Okay, so key takeaways here. We assess that at least China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have the capacity to access and potentially manipulate data in U.S. election-related computer systems, but we do not know whether they have specific plans to interfere with the functioning of these systems. So basically they're saying they could do it if they wanted to, but we don't know if they actually did. We assess that centralized election-related data repositories such as voter registration databases, poll books, and official election websites are most vulnerable to exploitation, and adversaries could use access to these systems to disrupt election processes. Systems that tabulate, transmit, or display election results are vulnerable to localized exploitation, but would be difficult to manipulate on a wide enough scale to alter the election outcome. That is the most glaring evidence that we have towards answering our second question. Even if they were to manipulate the election, would it be on a large enough scale to actually affect the outcome? According to this report, no. Adversary claims of manipulation would be difficult to disprove and could undermine public confidence in election results, so that in and of itself might be a reason for them to try and influence the results. Adversaries gaining access to U.S. election-related systems could disrupt the voting process, steal sensitive data, or undermine confidence in the election results, but we do not know whether any of them have any specific plans to manipulate election-related systems. Russia almost certainly recontinued all U.S. state election networks during the 2016 election cycle, accessed election-related infrastructure in at least 2 states, and exfiltrated voter data from at least 1 state. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are all capable of conducting similar operations during the 2020 election cycle, judging from their known cyber capabilities and past operations. So what this is saying is Russia successfully hacked into voter data in at least 2 states and gathered information in at least 1 state in 2016. Okay. The availability of sophisticated computer network intrusions or attack tools on the dark web gives additional countries and non-state actors the potential capability to interfere in the election. We judge that cybercriminals and hacktivists could also target infrastructure for financial or political reasons based on past incidents, possibly or definitely attributed to such groups. So what this is saying is that there's a bunch of basically hacker mercenaries out there that could be hired by any of these countries to perpetrate these attacks. Voter registration databases. States house There are voter registration databases predominantly on internet-connected systems that are designed for easy access because maintaining up-to-date voter registration records is a nearly continuous process. Adversaries could alter data to potentially prevent individual voters or groups of voters from voting, causing delays on election day or forcing voters to use provisional ballots. Adversaries could use the registration data, which in some cases is also publicly available for purchase, to tailor other interference or influence efforts. So again, they're saying that actors could access this voter registration data. Poll books. Registration databases transfer voter registration information to e-poll book devices or paper poll books used to check in voters at the precinct level. Some poll books are tied to an internet-connected database that adversaries would be able to easily exploit to manipulate data, with efforts similar to those from manipulation of registration databases. State and local election officials' websites. These sites provide public information about voting or, in some cases, are used to report voting results. Attacks on or compromises of these sites could deter individuals from voting or cast doubt on election processes. So this just highlights the different essentially parts or systems that state actors could infiltrate to try and interfere with the election. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is saying that there was a example in 2019 of a voting machine being hacked and used to run the popular video game Doom, which is pretty funny. If you don't know, there's kind of a trend on the internet where people try and hack devices to play Doom on the most absurd things. The best ones I've seen include a smart fridge, a Apple Watch, and an original Game Boy. So make of that what you will. All right, I'm skipping over this. Blah 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 blah. Here, we'll read this last part. Okay, recommendations to mitigating threats to infrastructure. We assess that enhancing the physical security and cyber protections of election systems and messaging the U.S. public and adversaries could mitigate some of the vulnerabilities of the complex U.S. election process. Potential measures include the following: physical security and cyber hygiene. This is basically reaffirming what we read about in, I believe it was this report here, but let's read it anyway. These terms refer to adopting best practices for the physical and cyber protection of election facilities and equipment, basic security measures in replacing obsolete equipment, strengthening password policy and audit processes, and implementing network segmentation might prevent less sophisticated adversaries from disrupting election processes, but probably would be insufficient to determine the most advanced and determined nation-state actors. Third-party vendor verification, establishing and refining screening procedures for vendors who manufacture or transship election infrastructure could reveal shared vulnerabilities or insider threats. Public messaging and education. Public messaging would be vital to provide accurate and timely information about the effects and limited scope of low-impact cyber operations. Partnership with state and local election officials, cybersecurity firms, and the media would help minimize commercial disruptions, as well as counter cyber-enabled information operations. Timely public messaging before the election would help to educate the public about adversary goals and make U.S. officials the trusted source of information about the integrity of the election process, recovery efforts, and investigations into cybersecurity attacks. Messaging to adversaries. Privately messaging adversaries to emphasize that attempts to manipulate U.S. election infrastructure are unacceptable and would have serious consequences, would deter them from taking such steps. Okay, so this last paragraph is saying the U.S. should go out of its way to diplomatically pressure these countries to not interfere with the elections, and this is saying that the vulnerabilities in our U.S. election systems should be made public, and we should basically clear away the people's ignorance on this matter because, among other people, Trump has been using the general voters' ignorance of how the election process works to try and steal the 2020 election. One more point I want to read here before we skip to the end. This is false manipulation narratives could undermine public confidence. So, we assess that adversaries could also make false claims about their ability to manipulate U.S. election infrastructure as part of a broader effort to undermine confidence in U.S. democratic processes. Much of the voting public probably knows little about the process of administering U.S. elections, which could allow false narratives to gain traction, and it most certainly has. Government efforts to investigate and publicly invalidate such claims could take weeks or months, providing time for concerns about election security to spread. Disproving claims would be impossible if adversaries invaded U.S. intelligence collection. And again, we basically saw this play out in 2020, right? And we are currently seeing it play out today. Adversaries could make wholly fabricated claims, such as announcing that they have compromised all U.S. voting machines, a claim that would be difficult and time-consuming or impossible for the U.S. government to disprove. Adversaries could also link an exaggerated claim, for example, about their ability to affect the election outcome, to actual operations such as DOS attacks, that's denial of service attacks, against election-related websites or intrusions into voter registration databases. Linking the two could introduce public doubts about the viability of the election, even if the actual cyber operations were unrelated to casting, tabulating, and reporting of votes. Lastly, a widely publicized compromise of election infrastructure probably would undercut public confidence in the election, even if the compromise was not used to manipulate election-related data or systems. So basically this is saying that it is possible that foreign actors might overstate their claims or their abilities to actually influence the election, again with the primary purpose of sowing chaos. Now, once again, Trump has bought into this. He is the primary source of these claims within America, and it seems that he is playing right into our adversaries' hands. All right, so let's summarize. Let's go back to our original 3 questions. Number 1, is there evidence that China directly tried, or any other actor for that matter, tried to directly interfere in the U.S. election? Based on everything we've seen from these reports, no. Although there is evidence that they used methods such as bribery, coercion, hacking into U.S. officials' email accounts, and manipulating social media to try and influence the election. Number 2, even if such a breach were possible, would it be able to sway the election? Again, according to this paragraph right here, the answer to that question is no. Number 3, is there a deep state government cover-up trying to keep evidence of voter manipulation from Trump? Well, if we go back to this email here, the answer is probably not, but maybe. There is at least some circumstantial evidence here that indicates discrepancy in reporting or discrepancy in identifying a certain group of Chinese state actors that could be construed as trying to hide or obfuscate evidence of voter fraud. In the next video, we will take a look at the second batch of documents, and we will further hone in on specifically question number 3, okay? The question of whether or not there was a deep state government cover-up is important and will be addressed in the next video more thoroughly. All right, hopefully that video will be out in like a day or 2. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed that deep dive analysis. Again, if you want to read through any of this information, I will link to the whitehouse.gov website in the description, and you can download any of these documents and read them for yourselves, or you could put your trust in me and that I've done a good job of summarizing them. All right, that's it from me. Have an awesome day. I'll catch y'all on the flip side.